Did you know that in 1982, the United States government forced the breakup of a company so powerful it had controlled nearly every telephone call in America for more than half a century? It wasn't a tech startup, a Wall Street titan, or an oil conglomerate. It was AT&T, the phone company. Known to most Americans as Ma Bell, it wasn't just another corporation. It was the phone company. For generations, you couldn't make a call, install a line, or even buy a telephone without going through AT&T. From your grandmother's rotary dial to NASA's launch control, from Wall Street's ticker lines to Cold War military bunkers, AT&T's network was everywhere. But on January 8, 1982, the hammer came down. The Department of Justice announced that AT&T would be dismantled, not fined, not regulated, broken. A company worth over $150 billion in today's dollars, owner of the legendary Bell Labs, cradle of the transistor, laser, and Unix, was to be carved into 8 separate entities. It was the biggest corporate breakup in American history. The official reason? Monopolistic abuse, a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. But behind that tidy legal justification lies something far more complex. For decades, AT&T was seen not as a villain, but as a public servant. It brought phones to every household. It connected farms and cities, hospitals and battlefields. It promised universal service and delivered it. So why destroy it? What if the truth isn't what we've been told? What if the breakup wasn't simply about protecting competition, but about breaking a system too deeply embedded in American life? What if Ma Bell wasn't just a monopoly, but a mirror of how government, science, and private power can quietly fuse into something untouchable? But to understand how it really happened, we need to go back.
We go back to the early 1970s, a time when the United States was reckoning with its institutions. The Vietnam War had fractured public trust. Watergate was beginning to cast a long shadow over Washington. Confidence in corporations, once seen as stewards of progress, had started to erode. And in the midst of this national questioning, a strange discomfort began to form around a company that had, for nearly a century, existed quietly in the background: AT&T. Why would a firm so foundational, so seemingly benign, suddenly draw the attention of federal prosecutors, lawmakers, economists, and reporters? Why was a system that had connected America for generations now being dissected, criticized, and eventually dismantled? AT&T wasn't like other companies. It didn't make consumer goods. It didn't advertise on television. It wasn't visible in the traditional sense. It was infrastructure, buried beneath streets, stretched between poles, humming inside walls. For most Americans, it was simply the phone company. And for decades, that simplicity was a comfort. But as the 1970s wore on, that comfort gave way to questions. Why was there only one phone company? Why couldn't customers buy their own telephones? Why were long-distance rates so high, and why did they never seem to change? Why did no one else, no startup, no foreign firm, no local competitor, ever challenge Ma Bell's reach? Was this dominance the product of superior engineering and good service? Or was it the result of legal engineering, regulatory capture, and a market built to exclude? What if AT&T's success wasn't just technological, it was architectural? What if the system had been designed layer by layer to reinforce itself, not to serve competition, but to suppress it? And who exactly benefited from this arrangement? The government? The public? Or the company itself? These weren't just economic questions, they were philosophical. They asked whether a private corporation could grow so large, so entwined with public life, that it began to resemble something more powerful than the state, a utility in name, a monopoly in practice, and a quiet architect of modern society. To find the answers, we must go further back still, to the origins of the system, to the dream that started it all, to the moment when a human voice first traveled through a wire.
It began not with a corporation, but with a voice. Thin, crackling, yet unmistakably human. The year was 1876. In a small Boston laboratory, a Scottish-born inventor named Alexander Graham Bell spoke the words that would ripple through history. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." The device was crude, cobbled together from wires, membranes, and magnets, but it worked. For the first time, sound had traveled across a wire, and with it, the seeds of a new empire had been planted. Bell was not a businessman. He was a teacher of the deaf, an idealist who believed communication could bridge the deepest divides between people. His invention was meant to connect, literally and figuratively. But others saw more. Investors, lawyers, and industrialists quickly gathered around Bell and his patents, sensing not just a revolution, but a business model. In 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was founded, and with it, a new frontier of enterprise was born. The early years were chaotic. Dozens of small telephone companies sprouted across the United States, wiring towns and neighborhoods with varying standards and incompatible equipment. It was a wild west of wires and switchboards, and no one yet knew who would win. But the Bell Company had one distinct advantage: its patents. By owning the rights to the core technology, it could license or litigate competitors into submission. Then came Theodore Vail. In 1878, Vail became the general manager and later president of what would become the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T. Unlike Bell, Vail was not an inventor. He was a system builder. He envisioned a nationwide telephone network, seamless, centralized, universal. To him, the future was not thousands of competing lines. It was one system, under one roof, with one philosophy. Vail's vision was not merely commercial, it was almost missionary. He believed the telephone should be a public good, available to all, but delivered efficiently by a single, integrated company. Competition, he argued, created waste, confusion, and inequality in access. What America needed, he said, was one policy, one system, universal service. And so AT&T began to grow, not like a startup, but like a state utility. Its expansion was methodical, calculated, and quietly endorsed by government regulators who saw value in the promise of order. Each new switchboard, each new cable laid was not just infrastructure, but another stitch in a growing monopoly that claimed benevolence as its guiding principle. At the dawn of the 20th century, AT&T was still finding its footing, but the foundation was clear. What had begun as a spark of human curiosity was now evolving into something much larger, a communications empire built not just on invention, but on ideology. The dream was alive, the network was expanding, and no one, yet, was asking whether the cost of connection might someday become control. By the early 1900s, AT&T had outgrown its role as a mere telephone provider. Under the leadership of Theodore Vail, it was becoming something far more ambitious, an architect of national infrastructure. But to realize Vail's vision of a single unified network, AT&T had to do more than innovate. It had to consolidate. The company's first major leap came through acquisition. Using its patent leverage and growing cash reserves, AT&T began purchasing local and regional telephone companies one by one.
At first, this was framed as a public good, standardizing equipment, improving service, and eliminating the chaos of incompatible networks. But beneath the surface, a different pattern was emerging. Each acquisition not only expanded AT&T's reach, it erased a potential rival. One of the critical moves came in 1900 when AT&T acquired a controlling stake in Western Union, its largest competitor in the communications space. Though the federal government forced AT&T to divest from Western Union just a few years later under antitrust pressure, the message was clear: Bell was not afraid to challenge giants. Meanwhile, AT&T was laying the groundwork for something that would become the backbone of American connectivity: long-distance service. In 1915, it completed the first transcontinental phone call connecting New York to San Francisco with a line that stretched over 3,400 miles. President Woodrow Wilson listened in. So did Alexander Graham Bell, now an old man who repeated his famous words into the telephone, this time heard from coast to coast. The company's expansion wasn't only physical, it also reshaped the regulatory landscape. In 1913, after pressure from the Department of Justice, AT&T signed the Kingsbury Commitment, a voluntary agreement to allow interconnection with independent telephone companies and to refrain from further acquisitions without federal approval. But this apparent concession only masked the deeper reality. AT&T was being recognized implicitly as the central pillar of American telephony. From its New York headquarters, AT&T began implementing vertical integration. It didn't just run the wires, it manufactured the phones, operated the switchboards, trained the technicians, and owned the research labs. This control over the entire ecosystem gave it an unmatched advantage: quality assurance, cost efficiency, and absolute dominance. For most Americans, the changes were invisible. They picked up their phones, heard a dial tone, and trusted the system would work. They didn't know that the very phone in their hand, its design, color, even its availability, had been decided by a committee at AT&T. They didn't see the corporate memos, the strategic mergers, the regulatory chess moves that slowly transformed a collection of wires into a fortress. By the 1920s, AT&T had become not just a phone company, but an institution, embedded in daily life, embedded in law. And its leadership believed with near religious conviction that this integration was not only efficient, it was necessary. The empire was forming, quietly, smoothly, with almost no resistance.
Between the 1920s and the 1950s, AT&T entered a phase of growth so sweeping, so structurally profound, that it no longer resembled a traditional company. It began to operate like a sovereign power. What had started as a telecommunications firm evolved into a self-contained universe, controlling not only phone lines and equipment, but also the rules by which the entire industry played. At the heart of this empire was Bell System, a vertically integrated machine comprising AT&T as the parent company, Western Electric as the manufacturing arm, and Bell Labs as the scientific engine. This structure allowed AT&T to oversee every layer of the communications stack, from the copper cables buried underground to the mathematical formulas behind signal clarity. Western Electric became one of the largest manufacturing operations in the country, producing virtually all telephones, switches, and transmission equipment used in the United States. It didn't sell to competitors. It didn't negotiate prices. It existed solely to serve AT&T. In 1940, Western Electric employed more than 200,000 people, making it one of the largest employers in America. Bell Labs, meanwhile, emerged as the crown jewel of American innovation. Here, AT&T scientists invented the transistor in 1947, an advancement that would spark the digital revolution.
They also developed solar cells, satellite communications, and early computing systems. Though these breakthroughs were monumental, AT&T was in no rush to commercialize them beyond its own needs. Innovation was treated as a means to reinforce control, not necessarily to disrupt markets. Throughout this period, AT&T expanded its monopoly through strategic acquisitions of smaller regional carriers, quietly folding them into the Bell system. Every merger was presented as a step toward universal service, but every merger also erased a competitor. By mid-century, AT&T controlled 98% of all telephone lines in the United States. The rest were independents, many of whom still had to route long-distance calls through AT&T's network, paying access fees for the privilege. The numbers tell a staggering story. By 1951, AT&T had more than 83 million miles of telephone wire crisscrossing the country. It operated 22 regional Bell companies, each assigned to a specific territory, eliminating any overlap or competition. The entire system was governed by a centralized hierarchy so vast and so efficient that even the federal government relied on it for national security operations. No phone could be sold or used in the United States unless it was manufactured by Western Electric and leased through AT&T. Customers didn't own their phones, they rented them, and any attempt to use a third-party device could result in service being terminated. Even the color choices were limited and approved by committee. The network was physically and culturally sealed. This was more than dominance. It was definition. AT&T didn't just control the industry, it was the industry. Its executives sat on panels that helped shape telecommunications law. Its engineers wrote the standards adopted by the FCC. It functioned as a public utility, a private monopoly, and a quasi-governmental entity, sometimes all at once. Few complained. Most Americans trusted the system. Their phone bills were consistent, the service was reliable, and the world was changing rapidly. AT&T's quiet stability felt like a comfort. But behind the calm was a creeping certainty. No one else could compete, and no one else was allowed to try. The monopoly had solidified, and no one, not even the regulators who helped build it, seemed eager to break the spell.
By the early 1960s, there was no longer any meaningful debate. AT&T had become the sole gatekeeper of American telecommunications. Its control wasn't just dominant, it was absolute. The few remaining independent phone companies existed only with AT&T's permission, their survival contingent on interconnection agreements and long-distance routing contracts that tethered them to the Bell system's will. For businesses that hoped to challenge AT&T directly, the landscape was unforgiving. Equipment makers who attempted to sell modems or telephones to consumers found their devices banned from the network. Even technical innovation couldn't find a path forward without AT&T's blessing. The company's private standardization of hardware and protocols ensured that outsiders couldn't plug in, literally or figuratively. In 1956, an inventor pumped code Hushaphone Corporation attempted to sell a small device that clipped onto a telephone receiver to improve privacy. AT&T sued, arguing that attaching an unauthorized device, even one as simple as a cup-shaped muffler, violated its service agreements. Though Hushaphone ultimately won the case after years of litigation, the incident was telling. The phone wasn't really yours, and neither was the network. Soon after, in 1968, the FCC ruled in a landmark case involving the Carter phone, a device that connected mobile two-way radios to the telephone system. AT&T had barred its use, claiming it could damage the network. But the FCC disagreed, affirming the right of users to connect non-harmful devices to the phone lines. It was a crack in the armor, but the walls of the fortress still stood. Inside the industry, competitors whispered their frustrations, but rarely spoke publicly.
Public utilities commissions in many states operated hand in glove with AT&T's regional companies, and few regulators wanted to challenge the status quo. After all, the service worked. Phone calls were reliable. The network was vast. The company delivered what it promised. And that, ironically, was part of the danger. AT&T's success had created a psychological monopoly as well. To question its dominance was to question whether the system could function without it. Could anyone else be trusted to run the nation's communications infrastructure? Was competition worth the risk of chaos? The company had so thoroughly embedded itself into American life that imagining an alternative felt unthinkable. Bell Labs continued to produce breakthrough technologies, but many of its most transformative inventions were delayed or suppressed, kept internal to preserve the status quo. The transistor, perhaps the most important invention of the 20th century, was handed off to other companies under strict licensing terms, designed not to create competitors, but to control them. Meanwhile, the corporate culture inside AT&T grew more insular. Managers rose through closed hierarchies. Engineers worked within rigid silos. There was little external pressure to change, to improve efficiency, or to consider disruptive alternatives. Innovation became cautious, incremental, and self-reinforcing. After all, when you own the entire game, there's no incentive to rewrite the rules. The silence grew louder. No new long-distance carriers, no consumer choice in equipment, no public discussion of alternatives. Just the hum of the dial tone and the soft clatter of switchboards, serving as daily reminders that the system was intact, untouchable, and complete. AT&T had become not just a company, but a closed loop. And in closed loops, even a whisper can sound like thunder.
At first, the resistance came as a murmur, a quiet letter, a curious column, a frustrated engineer who dared to say that something felt off. For decades, AT&T's dominance had been so total, so normalized, that any complaint seemed petty, or worse, unpatriotic. But slowly, imperceptibly, cracks began to form in the silence. One of the first sparks came from the fringes of the communications industry. Small equipment manufacturers, those who had been boxed out of the market by AT&T's strict control over phones and devices, began filing formal complaints with the FCC. They argued that their innovations were being stifled, that the public was being denied access to better, cheaper tools simply because AT&T refused to certify them. Consumer advocacy groups started asking questions too. Why couldn't you own your phone? Why were Americans paying rental fees for decades-old equipment when newer, more advanced models were available elsewhere in the world? Why did AT&T have the power to dictate not only service, but hardware, down to the cord, the jack, even the plastic casing? The press took notice. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, investigative journalists began publishing exposés that challenged AT&T's pristine image. The New York Times ran op-eds questioning the economic logic of the monopoly. Business Week profiled the company's political influence. A Harper's Magazine article bluntly asked, "Can anyone compete with Ma Bell?" Most of these critiques didn't reach mass audiences, but among regulators, economists, and tech insiders, they echoed like distant thunder. A new generation of policy thinkers, influenced by Chicago school economics, began arguing that monopolies, no matter how efficient, were inherently dangerous to markets. They warned that AT&T's size, secrecy, and control were breeding stagnation, not stability. Then came the voices from within. Some former AT&T employees, emboldened by retirement or frustration, started speaking out. Engineers who had worked at Bell Labs described projects that had been shelved, not for technical reasons, but because they might disrupt the company's pricing models. One technician recounted how a cheaper, more efficient switchboard system was blocked from deployment because it would have allowed smaller carriers to gain autonomy. In 1970, a maverick entrepreneur named William McEwen launched a new long-distance company called MCI, Microwave Communications, Inc., which sought to offer competitive rates using microwave relay towers. AT&T tried to block MCI's entry at every turn, refusing to interconnect its network and challenging the company's licenses in court. But MCI didn't back down. Instead, it filed a complaint with the FCC, and later, a lawsuit accusing AT&T of anti-competitive behavior. That lawsuit would become a slow-burning fuse. In congressional hearings, a few lawmakers began voicing concern about AT&T's influence. Representative Lionel Van Deerlen of California questioned whether the FCC had grown too cozy with the Bell system. Senators asked why the Justice Department had not pursued a serious antitrust investigation since the 1950s. The unspoken implication was chilling. Had Ma Bell grown beyond the reach of the law? Even customers began to notice. Long-distance rates were high and inflexible. Service requests took weeks to process. And if you dared to ask about switching providers, you'd be met with a confused stare. There were no other providers. The complaints, though scattered, were beginning to align. Not yet a storm, but a gathering wind. Something was shifting.
It didn't begin with a raid or a courtroom clash or a dramatic headline. It began with letters. In the early 1970s, the Federal Communications Commission started receiving an unusual volume of filings related to AT&T. Technical complaints, competitive grievances, and legal challenges from smaller players like MCI. Each letter on its own was modest, but together they painted a portrait of quiet defiance against a company long assumed untouchable. Inside the FCC, the mood was cautious. For decades, regulators had worked closely with AT&T, seeing it less as a corporate entity and more as a partner in national infrastructure. But the regulatory winds were shifting. A new generation of commissioners, influenced by ideas of market efficiency and consumer choice, began to question the foundational assumptions that had kept Ma Bell above scrutiny. By 1971, the FCC had opened multiple dockets examining whether AT&T's interconnection policies were fair. Could it really deny access to upstart long-distance carriers? Could it continue to require exclusive use of its own equipment? These weren't yet accusations of illegality, but they were the first cracks in the regulatory consensus. The Justice Department, too, began stirring. Deep within the Antitrust Division, a small team of lawyers revisited the dusty files of the 1949 case, an earlier antitrust suit that had ended with a narrow consent decree. That settlement had placed limits on AT&T's ability to enter unrelated markets, but it had left the core monopoly untouched. Now the question was different. Had AT&T's very structure become the problem? In 1972, the DOJ quietly launched a new investigation. There were no press conferences, no subpoenas delivered on camera. Just a methodical collection of documents, depositions, and economic analyses. AT&T executives noticed, of course. Requests for internal memos began arriving. Former employees were being interviewed. A sense of unease settled over the legal department in New York. In parallel, Congress was beginning to murmur. The Subcommittee on Communications, chaired by Congressman Lionel Van Deerlen, held hearings on the state of the telecommunications industry. Expert witnesses testified that AT&T's practices were hindering innovation. Economists presented models suggesting that monopoly pricing was costing consumers billions. Journalists reported that Ma Bell's influence extended deep into campaign donations and think tank funding. None of this, on its own, spelled doom. AT&T still held the public's trust. It still delivered reliable service to nearly every American home. But the atmosphere was changing. What had once been unthinkable, seriously questioning the company's structure, was becoming, slowly, politically possible. Perhaps most telling of all was AT&T's own response. Internally, Executives began commissioning white papers defending the Bell system model. They hired economists to publish articles extolling the virtues of vertical integration. Lobbyists increased their presence in Washington, reminding lawmakers that telecommunications was a matter of national security. But the legal tide was rising. In 1974, after nearly 2 years of preparation, the U.S. Department of Justice made its move. The antitrust case would not allege corruption or fraud. It would not accuse AT&T of failing to serve the public. It would argue something far more dangerous to the company's legacy, that its very success, its very structure, was illegal. And once that argument entered the courtroom, the question would no longer be whether AT&T had abused its power, but whether that power should ever have existed at all.
AT&T had always considered itself above the fray of corporate drama. While other firms dealt with market cycles and public relations crises, Ma Bell operated with the quiet confidence of a sovereign institution. It didn't advertise aggressively. It didn't chase headlines. It simply existed, ubiquitous, reliable, essential. But by late 1974, that posture was beginning to crack. The Department of Justice had formally filed suit, alleging that AT&T's structure violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. It accused the company of using its control over local phone service to suppress competition in the long-distance market. It argued that Western Electric, AT&T's manufacturing arm, created insurmountable barriers for outside equipment makers. And it pointed to MCI and other would-be rivals who had been systematically blocked or buried under red tape. AT&T's board of directors gathered for urgent meetings in its Manhattan headquarters. The legal department assembled elite teams of antitrust lawyers. Internally, the company referred to the DOJ's case not as a legal matter, but as the threat. They believed the charges were misguided, perhaps even ideological. After all, hadn't the system worked? Hadn't America's phone service been the envy of the world? In public, AT&T responded with calm professionalism. It issued statements reaffirming its commitment to universal service and technological progress. It emphasized that its operations were regulated at both state and federal levels, implying that any abuse would have been caught long ago. The tone was measured, confident, and subtly dismissive. But behind the scenes, a more sophisticated defense machine was mobilizing. AT&T's Government Affairs Division increased its lobbying in Washington. Executives visited congressional offices to remind lawmakers of the company's role in national security, emergency response, and economic stability. Quiet campaigns were launched through trade associations, think tanks, and academic institutions, some of which received generous funding from Bell affiliates. In the media, op-eds began appearing that questioned the DOJ's wisdom. Was it really wise during the Cold War to destabilize the nation's communications backbone? Would breaking up the Bell system lead to chaos, outages, and predatory pricing from opportunistic newcomers? These weren't planted stories necessarily, but they aligned neatly with the talking points coming out of AT&T's public relations department. Meanwhile, the company's legal team considered more structural tactics. If regulators were targeting vertical integration, perhaps the company could preemptively adjust its corporate structure, spin off non-core assets, grant more independence to regional Bell companies, or create buffer entities between Western Electric and the long-distance division. One internal memo proposed rebranding AT&T's various divisions as loosely federated partners rather than a single, centralized system. Another suggested reconfiguring interconnection agreements to create the appearance of market openness without ceding real control. But even as these strategies were drafted, there was a growing sense that the center could not hold.
AT&T executives had long believed that their greatest strength, the system's size, complexity, and total integration, was also their shield. Now it looked more like a target. The very structure that had delivered unmatched efficiency was now the heart of the DOJ's argument that no one else could compete because no one had been allowed to. Still, the company held its line. "We do not believe the Bell system violates any law," said AT&T Chairman John D. DeButz in a carefully worded statement. "We believe it is the most effective and equitable way to provide communication services to the American people." The message was clear. This was not a monopoly. It was a mission. But in the Department of Justice, and soon in the federal courts, that claim was about to be tested.
On November 20, 1974, the United States Department of Justice filed a civil antitrust lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The case was titled United States versus AT&T, and it struck at the heart of corporate America's most impenetrable fortress. The complaint was sweeping in scope. Filed under Sections 1 and 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act, it alleged that AT&T had unlawfully maintained a monopoly over both local and long-distance telephone services and had used its control of Western Electric and Bell Labs to suppress competition in telecommunications equipment and innovation. According to the DOJ, AT&T's structure was not just a byproduct of historical growth, it was a carefully maintained barrier to market entry. The complaint stated in precise legal language, AT&T has utilized its control over local exchange monopolies and its exclusive ownership of the only effective long-distance network to preclude entry, stifle competition, and deny consumers choice. At the center of the argument was MCI, the fledgling long-distance carrier that had spent years fighting for interconnection access. DOJ attorneys presented MCI's experience as a case study in obstruction, denied fair access to AT&T's local lines, stalled by regulatory delays, and targeted with aggressive legal tactics designed to bleed it dry. But MCI was not the only example. The government listed over a dozen instances in which innovators and manufacturers had been forced out, bought off, or simply blocked. The lawsuit did not call for immediate dissolution, but it demanded structural remedies, specifically the separation of AT&T's long-distance operations from its local Bell operating companies and from Western Electric. The message was unambiguous. AT&T's size and integration were, in themselves, the problem. The press exploded. Front-page stories ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. For the first time, Americans who had grown up with Ma Bell as a silent partner in daily life were forced to consider the phone company as something more controversial, a monopoly under federal indictment. Some headlines were clinical. Justice Department sues to break up AT&T. Others were dramatic. The end of the line for Ma Bell? Public reaction was mixed. Consumers were confused. Why fix what wasn't broken? But within business and legal circles, the filing was seen as a thunderclap. It marked the most significant antitrust action since the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, and it signaled that the federal government was no longer content to let natural monopolies operate unchecked. On Wall Street, AT&T's stock dropped nearly 5% in a single day, its steepest decline in years. Analysts warned that the uncertainty surrounding the case could shake investor confidence across the regulated utilities sector. Other monopolistic giants, from railroads to energy providers, took note. The rules were shifting. Inside AT&T, the filing crystallized what had previously been a growing sense of dread. Legal teams moved from contingency planning to full-scale defense mode. Public relations staff were ordered to prepare responses for every imaginable scenario. Executives began circulating talking points to employees, assuring them that the company would prevail and that the Bell system would endure. But in Washington, the tide had turned. For the first time in nearly a century, Ma Bell would have to stand in court,
not as a witness to progress, but as a defendant accused of using progress to prevent others from even entering the race. And the courtroom drama was just beginning.
On January 15, 1975, the courtroom at the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse in Washington, D.C., filled with the quiet murmur of anticipation. The first pre-trial hearing in United States the AT&T was set to begin. Rows of government attorneys, corporate counsel, economists, and journalists packed into the chamber. Some had notebooks, others carried yellow legal pads stacked high with years of filings, memos, and depositions. For many in the room, this was not just a lawsuit, it was history unfolding. Presiding over the case was Judge Harold H. Green, a former Justice Department lawyer with a calm demeanor and razor-sharp command of antitrust law. Though Green had yet to reveal how he viewed the arguments, both sides knew he would shape the destiny of the most complex antitrust case in modern American memory. AT&T's legal team entered with quiet gravitas. Led by William T. Coleman Jr. and Thomas G. Krattenmaker, they projected a sense of institutional confidence. They didn't come to posture, they came to argue the law. Behind them sat executives in dark suits, men who had spent decades guiding the Bell system through regulation, war, and innovation. They now watched as their life's work stood trial. Representing the Department of Justice was a young and aggressive team under Assistant Attorney General Thomas E. Cowper. They arrived sharp, energetic, and meticulously prepared. With them were boxes of exhibits, internal AT&T memos, market studies, letters from competitors denied interconnection, each item marked, logged, and tabbed for quick reference. The courtroom itself, though grand in architecture, took on the feel of a pressure chamber. Judge Green opened with procedural matters. He made it clear the case would be complex and long. Discovery would take years. Testimony would span industries. The government was alleging structural monopolization, not a narrow set of abusive behaviors, but a systemic design problem. And AT&T, for its part, denied every word. When opening statements began, the DOJ laid out their narrative that AT&T, by vertically integrating manufacturing, local service, long-distance lines, and research, had not merely achieved dominance, it had cemented it in such a way that no competitor could survive. They cited internal documents in which AT&T executives described fortifying barriers to entry. They played excerpts from depositions where regional Bell managers admitted to delaying connection requests from rival carriers. One particularly powerful moment came when a former MCI executive testified about a 3-year delay in getting approval for interconnection equipment, delay that cost the company millions and nearly collapsed it. AT&T countered with a vision of unity and national service. They invoked universal coverage, reliability, technical excellence. They argued that the system only worked because it was integrated, that tearing apart the parts would be like tearing apart a living organism. AT&T's lawyers showed charts illustrating economies of scale, graphs of declining phone rates over the years, and statistics on customer satisfaction. They called the DOJ's claims theoretical. Worse, they warned of a communications future marked by chaos, fragmentation, and corporate warfare. As testimony unfolded over weeks and months, Judge Green listened, mostly in silence, but every now and then he asked a question that made both tables shift in their seats. "Is there any evidence," he asked at one point, "that another company could have reasonably entered this market if not for the structure of the Bell system itself?" The room fell quiet. That single question echoed across months of litigation. The trial would stretch through nearly a decade of legal maneuvers, testimonies, delays, and breakthroughs. But in that first hearing, something shifted. For the first time, the invincibility of AT&T was placed under judicial scrutiny, not by regulators, not by engineers, but by the Constitution and the law. And once the gavel struck that day, the clock started ticking toward a verdict that would change the American corporate landscape forever.
AT&T's defense was not built on denial, it was built on logic. From the beginning, the company had no interest in appearing evasive or combative. It would not attempt to paint the government as overreaching or vindictive. Instead, it would present itself as rational, indispensable, and misunderstood. The company's central argument was simple. The Bell system was not a monopoly born of coercion. It was a natural evolution. Fragmentation, they claimed, would lead to inefficiency, degraded service, and technological stagnation. In their telling, the integrated structure wasn't a stranglehold on competition. It was a public service architecture designed to deliver universal access to every American, rich or poor, urban or rural. AT&T's legal team leaned heavily on data. They presented extensive charts showing that between 1950 and 1970, long-distance rates had dropped by over 50% in real terms. They pointed to the fact that despite its scale, the company's profit margins remained stable, not exploitative. If AT&T were truly abusing its power, where, they asked, was the evidence in consumer harm? Their economists testified that any competitor entering the telecommunications space would face insurmountable capital costs, not because AT&T blocked them, but because infrastructure was, by nature, expensive. In short, the Bell system's dominance was not due to manipulation, but to the physics of the marketplace. But behind these polished presentations, cracks were beginning to show. On cross-examination, DOJ attorneys presented internal memos in which AT&T managers referred to delaying interconnection applications until the carrier loses interest. In one instance, a regional executive described a policy of requiring redundant testing for third-party devices even when AT&T's own labs had already approved similar technology. When pressed on why customers were not allowed to own their telephones, an AT&T witness explained, "It is our responsibility to ensure network integrity. Ownership would invite damage, misuse, or unauthorized modifications." The logic was internally sound, but externally tone-deaf. It felt less like consumer protection and more like corporate paternalism. Perhaps the most revealing moment came when AT&T's counsel attempted to explain why Bell Labs had withheld certain technologies from commercialization. A government attorney asked why a promising data transmission system had been shelved in the late 1960s. The answer? Because it didn't fit into our long-range rate structure. The courtroom fell silent. What AT&T saw as systems engineering, the government saw as market manipulation. Still, the company fought on. It called Nobel-winning scientists from Bell Labs to testify to the technological brilliance that came from integration. It brought in rural policy experts to argue that without the Bell system's cross-subsidization, small-town America would be left behind. They cited national emergencies, from hurricanes to the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which AT&T's seamless network had kept the country connected. But the longer the trial dragged on, the more the narrative began to slip from their hands. What at once sounded like coherent strategy began to resemble self-justification. The idea that a single company could simultaneously be service provider, equipment manufacturer, and regulator of access, once taken for granted, was now under the microscope. Judge Harold Green rarely interrupted, but when he did, his questions were surgical. "Is it truly competition you fear, or simply the loss of control?" he asked during one exchange. The witness hesitated. AT&T was not flailing. Its case was logical, methodical, data-driven. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear logic alone would not be enough. The culture had changed. The legal theory had changed. And most dangerously, the mood in Washington had changed.
The Bell system had spent decades proving it could connect a nation. Now, it was struggling to convince the court that only it should be allowed to.
It came from a man no one had expected, a mid-level engineer, tucked deep within one of the regional Bell operating companies whose name had barely registered in the hundreds of witness lists. His appearance on the stand was unremarkable. His tone, even more so. Quiet, technical, deliberate. But the document he brought with him shifted the course of the trial. The engineer, whose identity was kept confidential for months due to fear of corporate retaliation, had saved a printed copy of a 1971 internal presentation circulated among AT&T's network planning executives. Titled Interconnection Risk Mitigation Strategic Framework, it was never intended for external eyes. The document laid out in precise language how AT&T planned to manage the threat of emerging competitors in long-distance service. One slide read, "Ensure physical dependence by maintaining exclusive control over critical local exchange switching points. Avoid transparency in routing protocols. Limit publication of interface standards to internal use only." Another slide, marked "Confidential, do not copy," included a flowchart detailing how to delay, reroute, or deny interconnection requests using a technical compliance loop that forced rivals to perpetually resubmit testing data. For months, AT&T's legal team had insisted that any delays faced by companies like MCI were bureaucratic necessities or isolated technical misunderstandings. Now the court had in hand a document showing that those delays had been policy, codified, deliberate, and systematized. The courtroom shifted in mood. Journalists in the press box leaned forward. The DOJ team, until then focused on slow, methodical evidence, seized the moment. They moved to enter the document into the record. AT&T's attorneys objected, arguing that the presentation represented a fringe viewpoint, never officially adopted. But when asked whether any executive had formally disavowed the strategy, there was only silence. The judge allowed it in. It wasn't just the document. In the weeks that followed, other surprises surfaced. A former marketing director at Western Electric testified, under subpoena, that internal pricing models were designed not only for cost recovery, but for strategic obstruction. He admitted that certain parts were deliberately priced higher for independent carriers than for Bell affiliates, under the logic that they'll either pass the cost to their customers or walk away. And then came the tape. A recording surfaced, made during an internal training seminar in 1973, featuring a senior AT&T executive explaining to new legal recruits how to manage regulatory ambiguity. In the recording, the executive chuckled, saying, "The FCC wants us to publish interface specs. Fine, we'll bury them in 10,000 pages of system documentation and send them the whole thing. Let them find it." The courtroom listened in stunned silence. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't overt sabotage. But it was something else. Contempt. Not just for competitors, but for the very idea that anyone else had a right to participate in the system. AT&T had long argued that its network was too fragile to allow careless integration, that control was a form of stewardship. But the emerging picture was different. A fortress, intentionally sealed, defended by red tape and technical obscurity, where exclusion wasn't an accident, it was strategy. What had begun as a case about market theory was now a story of behavior, a culture of protectionism, a quiet, calculated war against anything that threatened the system's integrity as defined by the system itself. Judge Green took note silently, his expression unchanged. But the tone of the trial had shifted. No longer was this a debate about efficiency versus regulation. It had become something deeper,
an inquiry into the nature of institutional power, and whether a private company had grown so large, so central, that it no longer recognized any boundary between the public good and its own survival. The illusion was breaking, and for the first time, it looked like Ma Bell might not be able to put it back together.
By the spring of 1980, the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle. The courtroom no longer felt like a battleground of economists and engineers. It had transformed into a theater of conflicting ideologies, reputations at stake, and the looming sense that something foundational was about to collapse. The DOJ continued to introduce witness after witness, not only external competitors, but also former AT&T insiders who spoke with the weariness of those who had once believed in the system, only to become disillusioned by what they saw behind closed doors. Then came the internal contradictions. On April 7, 1980, a pivotal moment arrived when an executive from one of the regional Bell operating companies took the stand, unexpectedly deviating from AT&T's coordinated testimony. Under oath and under pressure, he admitted that regional subsidiaries were not as operationally autonomous as the company had portrayed. Most major infrastructure decisions, including vendor selection, investment pacing, and service priorities, are made or heavily influenced by headquarters. That single statement undercut one of AT&T's central defenses, that the system was too decentralized to be considered a true monopoly. The idea that local Bells functioned independently had been a key narrative for years, but here, in federal court, it unraveled under sworn testimony. AT&T's legal team was caught off guard. The witness was immediately labeled misinformed by company spokespeople, and damage control began within hours. But the seed had been planted. Other regional managers began quietly expressing concerns about how far they were expected to push the party line and whether they too might be summoned next. Inside the company, tension mounted. Staff attorneys whispered in hallways. Senior executives disagreed behind closed doors over whether to negotiate a settlement or continue the fight. Some feared that prolonging the case would only deepen reputational damage. Others still believed in an eventual vindication. But even in private memos, there was a noticeable shift. The language moved from "when we win" to "if we lose." Outside the courtroom, the press amplified the drama. Front-page headlines across the country declared, "Cracks appear in AT&T's legal armor." Editorial boards began taking sides. The Washington Post called the trial a reckoning long overdue. The Wall Street Journal, more cautious, warned that dismantling the company could invite telecommunications chaos. On Capitol Hill, hearings multiplied. Lawmakers began citing the trial as evidence that antitrust enforcement needed revitalization across other sectors, from airlines to oil. Activists pushed for broader reform, arguing that AT&T wasn't an outlier, but a symptom of a system that had allowed corporate power to grow unchecked for too long. Public opinion, once ambivalent, began to shift. Polls showed growing support for the idea that phone service could be better and cheaper if competition were allowed. Consumer groups ran advertisements reminding Americans that they didn't own their phones and had paid rental fees for decades that often exceeded the phone's value many times over. Even shareholders began to show signs of rebellion. In 1981, at AT&T's annual meeting, a motion was introduced by activist investors calling for the board to consider structural reforms. It failed, but not before receiving an unprecedented 27% of the vote. Back in court, the pressure was visible. AT&T's lead attorneys began shortening their witness lists. Some expert testimony was dropped. Discovery requests that once took months to fulfill were now produced within days. The tone was changing, from defiance to triage. The trial, which had once felt endless, now had momentum. The judge's questions became sharper, his requests more pointed. And through it all, the Bell system, the most intricate, far-reaching corporate structure ever built in America, was starting to look like it might not survive the scrutiny it was never supposed to face. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was inside the building.
On January 8, 1982, after 7 years of legal battle and hundreds of thousands of pages of evidence, the United States government and AT&T announced a settlement that would change the structure of American telecommunications forever. It did not come with handcuffs. It was not punctuated by a gavel strike or a televised courtroom scene. Instead, it arrived in the form of a legal agreement, deceptively calm in its wording, but seismic in its consequence. The modified final judgment, as it was officially titled, was a voluntary consent decree between AT&T and the Department of Justice. But voluntary was a formality. It was a surrender dressed in legal pragmatism. The Bell system, the largest and most integrated corporate structure in the country, would be broken apart. Under the terms of the decree, AT&T agreed to divest itself of its 22 local Bell operating companies. These entities would be reorganized into 7 independent regional firms, nicknamed the Baby Bells. AT&T would retain its long-distance services, its research arm Bell Labs and Western Electric, but it could no longer offer local phone service or use its control over local exchanges to block competitors. The logic was clear. By severing the connection between the core network and the end-user gateway, the government hoped to foster a competitive environment in which long-distance providers and equipment manufacturers could finally enter the market on equal footing. When news of the settlement broke, reactions were immediate and polarized. The Department of Justice hailed it as a landmark victory for antitrust enforcement. This is not just a remedy for the past, it is a structural foundation for the future, said Assistant Attorney General William Baxter. Advocates of deregulation celebrated the agreement as proof that even the most entrenched monopolies could be dismantled peacefully through legal process. AT&T's official response was measured. In a statement released that morning, the company acknowledged the decision with regret, but also with a sense of purpose, vowing to continue delivering the highest standards of service in a new and evolving landscape. But behind closed doors, the mood was somber. For many AT&T executives, the breakup felt like an existential rupture. Some had spent their entire careers climbing the ranks of a system that was now being disassembled. Internal memos revealed confusion over operational continuity, regulatory uncertainty, and, most painfully, identity. What was AT&T now, if not the Bell system? In the markets, the reaction was volatile. AT&T stock plunged more than 12% in the days following the announcement, wiping billions off its valuation. Analysts scrambled to adjust models. Investors flooded switchboards with questions. Who owns what now? Will the Baby Bells compete? How will long-distance prices be affected? Within days, the Federal Communications Commission began the long and arduous process of implementing the decree. New regulatory frameworks were drafted, interconnection rules rewritten, technical standards updated to allow for competing networks to share infrastructure without gatekeeping. The telecommunications landscape, once frozen in amber, was suddenly in motion. The sound was not celebratory. It was eerie, like the silence that follows a building's demolition, not the bang, but the dust that hangs in the air afterward. What had begun as a sprawling legal inquiry had ended with a quiet line in a court filing and a precedent that would echo for generations. The Bell system was dead, not by revolution, not by scandal, but by a legal settlement whose cold precision achieved what no market force, no political speech, and no competitor ever could.
The ink had barely dried on the modified final judgment when the markets delivered their own verdict. In the days following the breakup announcement, AT&T's stock plummeted, dropping nearly 25% over the course of a month. For a company long seen as a safe harbor in American portfolios, the sudden volatility was jarring. Pension funds, insurance companies, and conservative investors who had parked billions in Ma Bell watched in disbelief as decades of perceived stability evaporated in a matter of weeks. Shareholder meetings turned tense. The questions were no longer about dividends or expansion plans. They were about survival. How would the company operate without its regional arms? Who would regulate pricing in this new decentralized environment? Would the baby bells undercut AT&T's long-distance services or eventually become competitors? Internally, the mood was somber and disoriented. For employees who had spent their careers within the Bell system, the breakup felt like an identity crisis. Job roles shifted overnight. Entire departments were reassigned, renamed, or made redundant. Middle managers who had once overseen entire regions now found themselves answering to unfamiliar corporate parents. Engineers at Bell Labs questioned whether their research would still be funded. Field technicians were unsure whose uniform they would wear the next quarter. Amid the chaos, leadership began to fracture. John D. DeButz, the long-serving chairman of AT&T, who had spent years defending the company's structure as a sacred model of public-private balance, had already retired in 1979, sensing the legal storm ahead. But his successor, Charles L. Brown, now found himself at the center of a corporate implosion. Though he had negotiated the final terms of the consent decree, Brown struggled to stabilize morale or define a coherent vision for the new AT&T. In 1983, facing mounting pressure from the board and Wall Street, Brown resigned, becoming the first post-breakup casualty at the top. His departure was not dramatic, but it was symbolic. The leader who had tried to navigate compromise had now been pushed aside for one who could deliver reinvention. He was replaced by James E. Olson, a seasoned AT&T executive with a reputation for pragmatism and cost discipline. Olson's mandate was clear: rebuild shareholder confidence, clarify the company's post-divestiture mission, and prove that AT&T could survive as more than just a ghost of a fallen monopoly. But rebuilding would be anything but easy. AT&T's long-distance division, once a crown jewel, was now surrounded by new competitors, MCI, Sprint, and soon others who had waited decades for the gates to open. Western Electric, its manufacturing arm, faced pressure to open its products to rivals or risk becoming irrelevant in a newly open marketplace. Even Bell Labs, once untouchable, began feeling the squeeze, told to prioritize applied research over pure science, to focus on product over prestige. Culturally, the shift was seismic. For most of the 20th century, AT&T employees had viewed themselves as civil servants in all but name, guardians of a public utility, stewards of national infrastructure. Now they were being told to think like competitors, like marketers, like risk takers. Some adapted, others left. A quiet exodus began. Longtime engineers, regional directors, and administrative veterans took early retirement or defected to the baby bells, drawn by the allure of a clean slate. The once revered company was now split into 8 fragmented parts, each with its own boardroom, agenda, and identity crisis. And while AT&T technically remained the parent, it no longer ruled the family. The organizational charts changed. But something deeper had shifted: the tone. What had once been a fortress of predictability was now just another player in an increasingly unpredictable game. And for the first time in nearly a century, Ma Bell no longer had a monopoly on the future.
The breakup of AT&T was not just the dismantling of a corporate empire, it was the beginning of a tectonic shift across the entire telecommunications landscape. For nearly a century, the industry had revolved around a single immovable star. Now, that gravitational center had fractured, and the pieces were spinning outward into a market suddenly filled with possibilities and risk. The most immediate ripple effect was competition. Long-distance services, once the exclusive province of AT&T, quickly became a battleground. MCI, long considered a scrappy underdog, expanded aggressively. Sprint, bolstered by its roots in fiber optic infrastructure, entered the fray with a sleek marketing campaign and promises of lower rates and better service. By 1984, only 2 years after the decree, AT&T's market share in long distance had already begun to erode, from over 90% to just under 85%, and falling. Prices dropped, innovation surged. Consumers, many of whom had never considered switching carriers before, now found themselves courted by new brands with colorful logos and catchphrases. Rate plans, once uniform and opaque, became more flexible, more transparent. The concept of choosing your phone company entered the American lexicon for the first time. Meanwhile, equipment markets that had been effectively closed exploded with new entrants. Companies like Northern Telecom, Siemens, and a flood of American startups began designing and selling telephones, modems, and switching gear that no longer had to pass through the bottleneck of AT&T's Western Electric. The telephone went from being a government-approved appliance to a consumer product, like a TV or toaster. Regulators, too, had to evolve. The Federal Communications Commission began rewriting its frameworks. No longer acting as a quiet overseer of a monopoly, it now had to function as an active referee in a competitive market. Rules around interconnection, number portability, and equipment certification had to be invented or radically revised. New questions emerged. How do you ensure fair access to a shared network? What happens when a Baby Bell refuses to cooperate with a rival carrier? The policy playbook was being written in real time. One of the most profound changes came in mindset. For decades, telecommunications had been viewed as a utility, a fixed, slow-moving service tied to copper wires and physical exchanges. Now it was being reimagined as a platform. Entrepreneurs began asking, what else can ride on this infrastructure? Could data, not just voice, be transmitted more efficiently? Could services be bundled, split, or virtualized? These weren't abstract ideas, they were the early seeds of the internet age. The Baby Bells, once carved out as localized entities, began innovating as well. Freed from the shadow of AT&T headquarters, some began investing in digital switching, exploring mobile telephony, and building out early broadband infrastructure. Others began eyeing their siblings, not as allies, but as potential rivals or future acquisitions. The courts had ordered a separation. The market began plotting reunification. And in the background, a new wave of legal and economic thought took root. The AT&T case became a case study in business schools and law faculties across the country. Antitrust lawyers studied it not just for its outcome, but for its process, the careful threading of public interest with structural remedy. Legislators cited it in debates over deregulation, competition policy, and the limits of corporate concentration. The echoes reached far beyond telecom. Airlines, railroads, energy, industries once assumed to be natural monopolies began facing their own reckonings. The lesson was clear. Dominance might be inevitable in the short term, but permanence was a myth. The day the Bell system was broken, the future cracked open. And from that rupture, an entire industry was reborn. Not with certainty, but with motion.
Years after the final court filings and the official divestiture, the scars of the AT&T breakup remained etched across the American corporate psyche.
The event had ended with no parade, no moment of catharsis, just a slow unwinding of the largest, most intricate monopoly the United States had ever known. But while the network was divided, the memory of Ma Bell proved harder to dismantle. Inside the new AT&T, a sense of loss lingered. Employees who had once recited the Bell system's mission, universal service, national unity, technological leadership, now found themselves in a company stripped of its former identity. The beige rotary phones and blue service vans were gone. The company's motto changed. The culture shifted. And though AT&T retained long distance and Bell Labs, it no longer had the gravitational pull it once did. Many retirees looked on with quiet grief. They had worked through wars, through the Depression, through the rise of the suburbs and the space race. To them, AT&T had not been a profit engine. It had been a civil institution, a calling. The breakup, in their eyes, wasn't just regulatory housekeeping. It was a dismantling of public trust, carried out by a generation that no longer understood the pact between company and citizen. For others, the pain was reputational. Before the case, AT&T had enjoyed a halo of respectability. It was a staple of the Dow Jones, a darling of educators and economists. Bell Labs alone had won multiple Nobel Prizes. After the case, that narrative changed. The company that once symbolized American ingenuity was now held up, fairly or not, as a symbol of bloated power and systemic exclusion. Alexander Graham Bell, long since gone by the time the trial began, was quietly recontextualized. No longer simply the benevolent inventor who brought voices to life, he became, like so many visionaries, an origin point for an institution that had outgrown its ideals. His name was still spoken in reverence, but now tinged with irony. The man who connected people had inadvertently helped create a system that excluded them. Even Bell Labs, the jewel of the system, began to lose its luster. Budget cuts, strategic realignments, and pressure for return on research forced the lab to shift its priorities. Where once scientists had been free to pursue pure inquiry, now they were steered toward marketable products. The environment of fearless experimentation, the very one that had birthed the transistor, the laser, the C programming language, grew narrower. The lab didn't disappear, but its spirit dimmed. In the decades that followed, many of the baby bells began to merge once again. By the early 2000s, 4 of the original 7 had reconsolidated under the AT&T name, creating a strange echo of the past. A company called AT&T once again existed, offered nationwide service, and sat atop the Fortune 500. But it was not the same. The scar tissue was different. The law had changed. The technology had changed. The culture had changed. What remained was the ghost of an institution that had once seemed permanent. Its switchboards and cables, its engineers and field agents, its rotary dials and rate charts, all now artifacts of a bygone industrial religion. Historians still debate whether the breakup was justified. Some argue that AT&T's structure enabled innovation, subsidized rural access, and protected national security. Others insist that its very size smothered progress, punished competition, and delayed the digital age. But both sides agree on one thing. The Bell system was unlike anything before or since, and when it fell, it left behind more than disconnected wires and corporate logos. It left a nation reconsidering the cost of control and the myth of benevolent monopoly.
The fall of AT&T was not just a turning point in the history of telecommunications. It was a mirror held up to every powerful enterprise that followed. For business leaders, founders, and investors, the Bell system's rise and collapse became a case study in both brilliance and blindness, a blueprint for building an empire, and a warning about what happens when it forgets who it serves. The first lesson is structural. Monopoly may feel efficient, but it breeds fragility. AT&T's integrated model worked until it didn't. For decades, the company justified its control through arguments of standardization, network integrity, and universal access. But those same arguments became liabilities once the political and cultural tides shifted. The moment regulators and the public began to value flexibility over uniformity, choice over control, the same structure that once protected AT&T became the very thing that doomed it. For modern founders, especially in platform businesses, the lesson is clear. Integration without openness invites scrutiny. The more central you become, the more transparent you must be. The second lesson is cultural. Success can outgrow self-awareness. Within AT&T, the belief in its own benevolence was so deeply entrenched that criticism felt like betrayal. Engineers, lawyers, and executives genuinely believed they were serving the public good, and in many ways they were. But that belief became armor. It blinded leadership to external realities. It made them slow to adapt, reluctant to listen, and dangerously confident in their own narratives. Today's corporate giants would do well to ask, is our mission still being interpreted the way we think it is? Do our customers still trust us? Or are we mistaking silence for approval? The third lesson is legal. Regulatory shelter does not last forever. For much of the 20th century, AT&T operated under the implicit blessing of the U.S. government. It had relationships with regulators, support from the military, and a reputation as a responsible steward of infrastructure. But the Sherman Antitrust Act, long dormant in telecom, proved that even deep-rooted legal inertia can shift under pressure. When the environment changes, old protections become brittle. In today's climate, where tech giants walk a similar tightrope, this lesson feels particularly urgent. Legal risk is not static. It compounds, quietly, until a single triggering event, public outrage, political transition, market failure, forces the system to respond. The fourth lesson is strategic. Innovation hoarded is innovation wasted. Bell Labs invented the transistor, but did not commercialize it at scale. It developed data technologies, yet slowed their release to protect revenue streams. In its effort to preserve the status quo, AT&T inadvertently delayed the very future it could have led. Modern companies that sit atop transformative technologies must weigh the cost of control against the opportunity of acceleration. The temptation to hold back, to protect margins, to delay disruption is strong. But history shows that control eventually invites challengers, and delay often empowers competitors. And finally, the fifth lesson is existential. No company is too big to be questioned. AT&T was once seen as a permanent fixture of American life, like the post office, like the power grid. It defined the way people communicated. But permanence is a story businesses tell themselves. The reality is that every dominant system contains the seeds of its own undoing, whether through cultural arrogance, technological inertia, or legal miscalculation. Startups should study AT&T not just for its fall, but for its design, its discipline, its audacity. It built the modern telecommunications infrastructure with astonishing precision. But in the end, its failure to evolve was not technical, it was philosophical. The question isn't just, how did AT&T fall? The question is, how many companies today are walking the same path, believing they never will?
In the years since the breakup of AT&T, the American communications landscape has transformed beyond what anyone in that 1982 courtroom could have imagined. The world is now mobile, wireless, borderless. Phones are no longer tethered to walls. They are portals in our pockets. Data, not voice, is the primary currency. And yet, as we look around, the echoes of the Bell system still linger. The breakup was supposed to usher in perpetual competition. For a time, it did. But by the early 2000s, the industry had begun to consolidate once again. Baby Bells merged and remerged. SBC acquired Pacific Telesis, Ameritech, and BellSouth. And in 2005, it acquired AT&T itself, taking on the name of the company it was once carved out from. In a twist of corporate resurrection, the ghost of Ma Bell returned, now wearing a new suit, speaking the language of mobile data and streaming video. Today, that new AT&T is once again a titan. Not alone, but part of a handful of mega corporations that dominate the digital infrastructure of modern life. Alongside Verizon, Comcast, and T-Mobile, it helps control how information flows, who gets access, and at what cost. And in the background, another group of giants, Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple, have emerged to shape the platforms on which the 21st century operates. The names have changed. The power has not. We've replaced rotary dials with algorithms, switchboards with clouds, and copper wires with fiber optics. But the fundamental questions remain. Who controls the infrastructure of connection? Is scale a tool for innovation or a mask for exclusion? Can competition truly survive in markets that reward domination? Some argue that today's digital empires are nothing like Ma Bell. They move faster, innovate constantly, and face global competition. Others argue that the very technologies they've built, platforms, ecosystems, data monopolies, are far more difficult to regulate than a telephone line. Antitrust regulators are once again awakening. In Washington, in Brussels, in capitals around the world, lawsuits are being filed, investigations launched. Terms like gatekeeper, self-preferencing, and network effect now populate court documents. But will history repeat itself? Or has the game evolved beyond the reach of 20th century remedies? The story of AT&T is not just a historical episode. It is a pattern. A rise through invention. A dominance through structure. A fall through law. And perhaps a resurrection through rebranding. Which brings us to the present. The cables may be different. The platforms more invisible. The pace faster. But the architecture of power? It still looks familiar. The Bell system may be gone, but the questions it raised about trust, access, control, and the role of corporations in public life are more alive than ever. And if history is any guide, the file is closed for now.